Thank you, Chip. Please rise in body or spirit for the lighting of the chalice. We light this chalice to celebrate the inherent worth and dignity of every person, to reaffirm the historic pledge of liberal religion to seek that justice which transcends mere legality and moves toward the resolution of true equality, and to share that love which is ultimately beyond even our cherished reason, that love which unites us. In the spirit of inclusivity and welcome, take a few moments and greet people around you, especially someone you don't recognize. Please join me in the opening words. We, bearers of the dream, affirm that a new vision of hope is emerging. We pledge to work for that community in which justice will be actively present. We affirm there is a struggle yet ahead, yet we know that in the struggle is the hope of the future. We affirm that we are co-creators of that future, not passive pawns. And we stand united in affirmation of our hope and vision of a just and inclusive society. We affirm the unity of all persons. We affirm brotherhood and sisterhood that allows us to touch upon each other's humanity. We affirm a unity that opens our eyes, ears, and hearts to see the different but common forms of oppression, suffering, and pain. Yet we are one, and we celebrate our hopes for human unity. Within ourselves and within the gathered community, we will discover the strength not to hide in difference, affirming that hope, publicly expressed, energizes and enables us to move forward. Together, we pledge action to transcend barriers, be they racial, political, economic, social, or religious. We pledge to make our tomorrow become our todays. And now, please rise in body or spirit, and together we will sing hymn number 325. It's in the hardcover hymnal, and we're only singing verses 1 through 3.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I was asked to speak about why I support UU in the stewardship drive. I would say the reason I keep coming here is because when I first came here back in 2019, February, I can't remember the date, I walked in. Actually, let me circle back. Saturday, I went to a support group that was unrelated to the church, and a member of the church, Lee, asked me to come on Sunday, and I was like, I don't know about that because I might burst into flames. And he said, and he was like, no, we're not that kind of church. And I was like, oh, okay, cool, I guess. So I came the next day, and I happened to see Tony and Tam, two amazing, beautiful people. They led the worship service that week, and they gave a sermon on nonviolent communication. And like the universe must have been speaking to me because that's something I needed to hear at that point in my life. So I started attending the church, and I wasn't even a member yet, haven't signed the book, and somehow they asked me to help with the pride float. And I was like, I'm not a member, are you sure? And they was like, yeah, we would love to have you. And I was like, okay. So doing that and seeing the love poured into the church, the care for the kids, the fight for social justice, diversity, and just knowing that I can be my full self, especially living in Alabama as a young gay black man, and knowing that I'm accepted no matter what, it just let me know this is a beautiful place that needs to continue for the next generations, and we need to continue to fight against all of these social ills in the world. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kate Staub, and I am a member of the board of this church. Our church is supported by those who call our church home and by those who support the efforts of this church to change our world for the better. If this is your first time here today, you can just pass the plate when it comes around. We are just glad that you're here. Although if you did fill out a connection card, you can put that in the plate. We share our cash plate every Sunday with local organizations whose work reflects UU values, which are to care for marginalized people, advocate for real and systemic change, defend our environment, and promote justice and equity for everyone. Our Share the Plate recipient this month is the Offender Alumni Association. We had an awesome speaker last week here who talked about it, so if you missed it, I hate that, but he gave us a lot of great background about it. The Offender Alumni Association, their mission is to create a network of justice-impacted individuals who inspire each other to reduce crime, develop healthy relationships within their community, and they really help these people get ahead economically, socially, after they are released from prison. So it's really a civic empowerment program. We appreciate your donations, either by placing them in the plate today when it comes around. You can also mail your donation to the church. We also have PayPal, Venmo, and Zelle. Our Venmo account is at UUCBHAM. Our Zelle account is our office email, which is office@uucbham.org. And you can designate whether your entire donation is going to go to the Offender Alumni Association or your entire donation can go to the church. And if you don't designate, we will just split it down the middle. Thank you for your generous support of our church and our Share the Plate recipient. May we give in love and in hope.
Now is the time in our community when we share what we carry with us on this day, joy or sorrow. For those of you online, please share yours in our online chat and remember to hold others by placing their parentheses around their names. For those of you in person today, you're welcome to come forward and drop a stone in the water in memory or in honor of whatever's in your heart today. Please come forward. Today, we celebrate with Gerda Carmichael. Gerda, raise your hand. Gerda celebrated her 93rd birthday this past Wednesday. Today, we also lift up Wanzetta Flowers. She's at home recovering from a rotator cuff surgery. Please keep her in your thoughts. May we keep one another in our hearts and minds in the spirit of community and love. And join me in the spirit of meditation, followed by a moment of silence. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It is not proud. Love bears all things. We know these words. Use these words. And when we refer to one another, one person loving another, love looks different when we relate to systems. Love looks different in the face of injustice. It is then that love is resistant. Love is defiant. It is not backing down. It is staying in the streets. Love is holding each other and ourselves accountable. Love is challenging because none of us is free until all of us are free. Love is present. Protest is love. Love bears all things. Let's take a moment of silence. Blessed be.
Good morning. Do I have any children who'd like to join me for a story real quick? You want to come sit down? Hey, how's it going? How's everybody doing today? Good? Good. So do any of you guys have collections at home, things that you collect? What do you collect? You collect what? Miniature things? That's a good one. What do you collect, Royal? Walking sticks. That's an interesting collection. Anybody else? Rocks? Ugh, rocks are a really good thing to collect. This story that we're going to read today is about someone who collects words, and it's called The Word Collector. Collectors collect things. Some people collect stamps, some people collect coins, others collect rocks, some collect art, bugs, baseball cards, comic books, and Jerome, what did he collect? Jerome collected words. He collected words he heard, like, "My trip to Peru was perfectly pleasant." Certain words caught his attention. He collected words he saw, like "Willow Tea Shop." Certain words jumped out at him. He collected words he read. Certain words popped off the page, like emerald. Short and sweet words: spark, bloom, drift, dream. Two-syllable treats: treasure, motif, whisper, candid, hover, glimmer. And multi-syllable words that sounded like little songs: kaleidoscope, guacamole, wonderful, geometry, symphony. There were words he did not know the meaning of at first, but they were marvelous to say. Aromatic, vociferous, effervescent. There were words whose sounds were perfectly suited to their meaning: molasses, torrential, Tyrannosaurus rex, smudge, bellow. Jerome filled his scrapbooks with more and more of his favorite words. Jerome's collection grew. He began organizing them: dreamy, science, sad, action, poetic. One day, while transporting them, Jerome slipped and his words went flying. As he began to pick them up, he noticed his collections had become jumbled. Big words next to little words, sad words next to dreamy words. Jerome began stringing words together: whisper, symphony, electric, peace. Words he had not imagined being side by side: savor, dreams, cascading, stars. He used his words to write poems. He used his poems to make songs. They moved, they delighted. Some of his simplest words were his most powerful, like, "I understand," "I'm sorry," "Thank you," "You matter." Jerome eagerly collected more and more of his favorite words. The more words he knew, the more clearly he could share with the world what he was thinking, feeling, and dreaming. One breezy afternoon, Jerome climbed the highest hill, pulling a wagon packed with his word collection. He smiled as he emptied his collection of words into the wind. He saw children in the valley below scurrying about, collecting words from the breeze. And Jerome had no words to describe how happy that made him. Thank you for listening. Do you guys want to go downstairs now? All right, if we could sing them down, thank you.
I'm so happy to announce our speaker today. Mary Scott Hodgen is an award-winning journalist from Birmingham. She joined WBHM as the health and science reporter in 2018. She's reported extensively on COVID-19 pandemic, as well as issues related to the state's criminal justice system. From 2019 to 2022, Mary Scott led the development of WBHM's first narrative podcast. It's called Deliberate Indifference. It was a 7-part series tracing how Alabama's prisons become among the nation's most dangerous, culminating in years-long battle with federal officials. In 2021 and 2022, Mary Scott was recognized by the Alabama Broadcasters Association as Best Large Market Radio Reporter. She's received multiple regional Edward R. Murrow Awards, don't say that 3 times fast, and Alabama Associated Press Media Editor Awards, including Best Specialist Reporter, Best Investigative Reporting. Prior to joining WBHM, Mary Scott worked in marketing and documentary filmmaking and taught English while living abroad. She's a native of Birmingham. She earned 2 undergraduate degrees from the University of Alabama, and recently she got her Master's of Business Administration from UAB. She is fluent in Spanish, enjoys exploring the outdoors, listening to music, and experimenting in the kitchen. Please welcome Mary Scott Hodgen.
Okay, let's see, you guys can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me come speak with you today. I feel very honored to be here, and I get asked to speak sometimes at different events, but I've never had like a podium like this. So normally it's more interactive, so I'm gonna try to keep it, just me speaking, but clearly if any of you have anything you wanna add or any questions or anything like that, I'd be happy to take any questions or anything afterwards. So I've been told about 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep the watch. But I was sort of given an open book to speak to you all today. As was mentioned, I recently launched a podcast last summer called Deliberate Indifference, and it chronicles the story of Alabama's prisons and really how they got to this point where they're at right now, which is where they are, they're known as some of the most violent prisons in the nation. They're very overcrowded. They're very understaffed. I imagine some of you have probably read about some of these issues and are aware of that. So I hope to not kind of repeat things that you already know, but I thought I would walk you through my process as to how I produced this work and started reporting on prisons, because I'm actually the health and science reporter at WBHM, so I didn't have any experience reporting on criminal justice or prisons prior to 2019. And so back in 2019, I started to look into the prisons, and early that year, because in addition to the Department of Justice looking into Alabama's prisons, there's been a much longer lawsuit that's been going on for years about mental health care in Alabama's prisons. And this is also a federal case. It's gotten a lot of attention. And the interesting thing about lawsuits is that they give you a lot of information. So if you've ever been involved in a lawsuit, that might be a headache for you. But if for something like the prison system, it's very insightful because otherwise it's really difficult to know what's going on inside our state's prisons. The state's prisons, just like many jail systems, they don't release a lot of information. A lot of information is protected under what they call like privacy. You know, they can't release it because of security issues or whatever, you know, reason they might give. But the reality is there's thousands and thousands of people inside our state prisons, and you don't really ever get a chance to go in and check it out and see what's it like what are the conditions that these people are living in, what's happening inside. And then of course communication is really limited inside state prisons. So people in prison can write letters, they can call you on the phone, but you know, you can't just pick up a phone and call someone in prison, except the fact that inside our state prisons there is a lot of contraband, so a lot of people do have access to cell phones, which is kind of surprising to a lot of people. And a lot of people inside prison are active on like social media because they have cell phones. So anyhow, let me back up. So back in 2019, I started looking into the state's prisons because of the mental health care issues inside. And so I toured a state prison. I talked to some people about the issues of receiving and giving mental health care inside prison. And that was before the Department of Justice released its report, which they released in April of 2019. So later that year, when the report came out, I started looking into that as well because at WBHM, we were a really small team at the time, and I was the only one who had been inside a prison. So have any of you read the report by the Department of Justice about Alabama's prisons? I see one hand. I recommend reading it. It's really difficult reading, so you know, obviously, if you have any potential triggers there, you know, be careful. But the report's open to the public. It's 50 pages. The first one came out in April of 2019, as I said, and it detailed, very detailed, accounts of the violence inside our state prisons. And this report was specifically about violence among incarcerated men. And it's important to note that all of what I'm talking about, like the Department of Justice reports, the violence, all of this is the state's prisons for men. The state's prisons for women have their own history, also involving the federal government, which I am not an expert on and I haven't really covered a lot about, but it's also interesting, you know, to look into. So anyways, I read this report in April of 2019, and you can't really look away once you read it. It's kind of incredible what's going on inside the state prisons. And a lot of it, as I mentioned, has to do with really two big issues. The state's prisons are really overcrowded and they're really understaffed. So in a lot of cases, you have a room like this where you have bunk beds stacked in the room, and you have maybe 150 men sleeping in a room together, and maybe you have like one officer who, you know, is supposed to be observing the room. And maybe that officer is not even in the room. Maybe they're, you know, outside those doors right there. And so a lot of stuff happens that they can't see, but maybe they don't want to see, and you have sort of an economy that has been created inside prison where people are selling contraband, they're selling drugs, which comes in various ways. One of the ways is through people who work in the system. So I started to try to understand this a little bit more and try to figure out how to report on it. Reporting on prisons is difficult because it's hard to interview people in prison. It's hard to, you know, I can't just go there like what I normally do, where you go and you take pictures of a place, you try to see it for yourself so you can, you know, translate that to the public. And so that's why it was this unique opportunity to report on it in more detail, because all of these federal reports and the lawsuit I mentioned about mental health care, all of those things provide a lot of documentation. So you have a lot of evidence that you can cite. You know, I can say the federal government says that inside Alabama's prisons there's one officer for 200 men. I also hear that from 3 other, inmates who are living in that same dorm. So you can kind of corroborate that evidence, when normally that's really difficult. To contact people inside prison is challenging. I didn't have really any contacts at first in 2019, and I didn't really know how to make them. Like, how do you find sources inside prison? And so I started sort of trying to create a network outside of prison to help me get inside prison. And that had a lot to do with the organization y'all mentioned earlier, like OAA, the Offender Alumni Association. That's a really excellent organization. And it's one of the most authentic groups that I've really ever come into contact with, because it's really created by people who've been in the system and who are helping one another exit the system and deal with, having loved ones inside, right now. So I went to their support group meetings. I started going to some other meetings, rallies, that kind of thing, connecting with folks whose husbands were in prison, who had sons in prison. And then I would write letters, like old school letters, mail them with a stamp, and send them in. And it's weird because that people can read these. Like, that maybe a guard could read it. And I didn't want to encrypt, I didn't want to get anybody in trouble, which became a constant concern of mine throughout my reporting. And in fact, I have had an experience where a man in prison talked to me on the record, and he used his name, and then he was transferred to a different prison and put in solitary, and he got like a citation that said he spoke, or that he violated the media issue or something. This was also during the recent strike inside state prisons, if you guys are familiar with the strike that occurred last year, where state prisoners did a labor strike inside the state prison. Anyhow, I'm jumping around too much. But anyways, finding folks inside prison was a challenge. But people started calling. And then, I would talk with them and talk with them and talk with them. And they would connect me with other people. And so I started to sort of create a network there and talk with people, for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so at the same time, I was, this was in 2019 and 2020. Of course, the pandemic kind of interrupted things. But during all of this time, I also wanted to track what was the state doing in response to the Department of Justice dropping this report. And the report was a big deal, because it was the Department of Justice saying, you need to get your act together, or we're going to, potentially file a lawsuit, potentially intervene. And so the state did respond. It got a lot of attention, too, a lot of media attention. And Governor Ivey created a study group in Montgomery where they were meeting. They do this often, you might find, if there's like an issue in the news, the state might create these study groups where they have folks from different arenas come in, and you have lawmakers, you've got people on the criminal justice side who meet and talk about ideas for change. And I think the interesting thing is that there are ideas for change, and they did get traction. Sitting in Montgomery, not many people have the chance to just go sit in Montgomery and listen to these meetings all day, and they're not always the most stimulating, but they are, you do find that there are actual conversations where you say, oh, okay, like, yeah, this is a level-headed conversation, like, there's some agreement here, there's evidence being presented, and there's, like, maybe this is a policy that could change things. For example, like sentencing changes, right? How do you reduce the prison population? Well, maybe you either send people for longer periods of time, or you send fewer people. And so there's a lot of different conversations about that, and obviously a big one over the past decade or so has been sentencing reduction for for anything related to drug use or drug sales or anything like that. And there has been some progress in that area, but what happened at the same time is that you have cases that get a lot of attention, so very high-profile crimes that really shape the narrative, and for obvious reasons. Crime is horrific, and it can be really terrible, and so the immediate response is, well, we don't want that to happen, so let's clamp things down. And so in 2019, as the state was responding to the Department of Justice report, they were also responding to a crime that had occurred, I can't remember if it was 2017 or 2018. I think it was 2018. where a gentleman was accused, I believe the case is still pending, so he hasn't been convicted yet, if he is going to be convicted. But he was accused of killing 3 people. This was the case of Jimmy O'Neill Spencer. I don't know if y'all have heard about it. It got a lot of attention. And in response, this created a clamp down on the parole system. So are any of you familiar with what, like, the news about the state's parole system? Just like a show of hands. Okay, this is important because it's like simultaneous and it's very interesting. As the state is having to address issues of overcrowding, understaffing, violence in the state prisons, they're also feeling the pressure of having to address a failing parole system is sort of the narrative there. Because what happened is, or what the narrative of what happened is that this man named Jimmy O'Neill Spencer was released on parole and then murdered 3 people in Gunnersville, and they were pretty, they were like really graphic crimes. And so the state put in charge somebody new of the parole board. They totally changed how the parole board works, where the governor gets to appoint who oversees the parole board. And since then, there's been a dramatic decline in paroles, like very dramatic. So not only it went from about 50% of paroles being granted to 10%, but also much fewer paroles are even being heard. So it, the denominator went way down, and then the percentage of the grant rate went way down, and that had a huge impact. Like, I was talking to people on the phone, all the time from 2019 to 2021, and people just lost all hope because just about everybody inside state prisons has a parole date, unless you're in prison with life without parole, then you're gonna probably have a parole date. And so people don't really have a lot of incentive to do any kind of classes or, and even because they're doing them and then they don't get parole. So I don't want to go down this road too far, but I recommend reading more about this because it's been a very big issue and it's had a big impact on morale inside state prisons. And then, of course, the state had talked about these other, possible ideas of how to address issues inside the state prisons. For example, adding more programming inside state prisons. That takes money. Changing things with sentencing laws. And then in 2020, COVID interrupted that legislative session. So maybe some of those, bills would have gotten through. I'm not sure if they would have or not. But regardless, the session ended and they didn't even look at any of them. And so you never really saw like a legislative response to the Department of Justice intervention or the issues inside the prisons until, of course, the state fulfilled its plan that it had been sort of talking about for a long time, which is this plan to build new prisons. And so that's what we're seeing right now. The state has approved a plan to build 2 new mega prisons for men. And they're using about $400,000 of COVID relief money for that. Or is that right? Am I right on that? Is it 400 million or 400,000? So yeah, 400 million, thank you. And so $400 million of COVID relief money going towards 2 new mega prisons for men. And the interesting thing to note is that the oldest prison that Alabama has is Tutwiler, the state's prison for women, which, they say that's down the road. They also want to replace Tutwiler, but for now we have these 2 prisons for men on the books. So, kind of in conclusion, I guess, the podcast came out last year. And despite the fact that I would say issues remain the same, maybe even worse, the deaths inside our prison system are pretty, they really stand out. So I can't tell you for sure like how our state death rate compares nationally right now, but what I can tell you is that the Department of Justice said that Alabama had one of the highest homicide rates in the nation when they stepped in 2019. And now, recently, those numbers have only gone up. Like at Donaldson, for example, where you can get really good data because the Jefferson County coroner releases that information. Like last year, there were, I don't want to misquote these numbers, but it was like 38 deaths and that were accidental, which means a homicide, a suicide, or an overdose. And you just don't see those kinds of numbers in a lot of other states. But I will say that there is a lot of conversation, and I think that people do care about it and they want to see change. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot after releasing the podcast, because I got a lot of response from people. A lot of people emailed, wanted to know more. A lot of people emailed with their own stories, people who have, children inside the prison system or, other loved ones. And what gets me is that there are so many people who are touched by this system, like who know somebody who's in prison. But I think that the element of shame around incarceration and just crime in general keeps that from kind of coming to the surface. And so therefore, the narrative gets perpetuated that like nobody cares about prisons and nobody cares about people inside prisons. But I keep coming back to this idea of like, how does that make sense when there are so many people who have, maybe not been in prison, but been in jail or been, arrested. And so I think the shift has to kind of be in that area where we feel more comfortable talking about experiences with incarceration and crime. And the question needs to be really more focused on like, how do we make communities safer? Because ultimately that's what interrupts all of the conversations about progress. It's because crime does happen. And so how do we reduce crime? Because, if everyone always says if prison led to less crime, we'd be one of the safest countries in the world because we lock up a lot of people. So anyhow, I'll leave you with that. I feel like you all are a very thoughtful group who probably, thinks about a lot of these things a lot, but so I'm not sure if I'm really contributing much to you, but I certainly appreciate your attention. And yeah, I encourage you to keep following what's going on in the state's prisons, because ultimately it speaks a lot about us as a society. So thank you so much.
I thought it was very kismet that, is that the right word, kismet, meant to be that Mary was here today, because John Archibald wrote a story yesterday. Did anybody read it? About us torturing prisoners. There was a man who was literally burned to death or baked. He was in the Donaldson prison in 2020, and then in Walker County, a man froze to death. And the article, I highly recommend it. Please rise in body or in spirit for the closing hymn, Extinguishing the Chalice, and remain standing through the benediction closing words. The hymn is 179, and it's in the hardcover hymnal. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go in mindless oblivion. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go without challenging yourself or others. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go in utter ease and comfort. When I say go in peace, I mean go in peace, seeking justice. I mean go in peace, committed to equal rights and opportunities for all. When I say go in peace, I mean go in peace that has created them together. We build communities of true solidarity, deep compassion, and fierce, unrelenting love. Go in peace. That was the extinguishing the chalice. Now I need to do closing words. But this is quick. My friends, when you go from here, know that our hearts are always in a holy place, for we are always connected to one another. Know that deep down, our hearts beat in one universal rhythm. May we find the sacred space to hear it.